Hello and welcome to the ROPESCAST, the independent voice of the Middle East. I'm your host, Ksenia Svetlova. ROPE stands for the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security. We are a young organization dedicated to laying the groundwork for a post-conflict Middle East. We do this by connecting forward-thinking Israelis and Palestinian emerging leaders with like-minded peers across the Middle East. At ROPES, we share a holistic vision for our region, one where every individual has far more to gain from regional integration and conflict resolution than they have to lose. For more information on our work, please visit our website at ropes.org. And today joining us is Dr. Sanam Vakil, a director of Middle East and North Africa program at the Chatham House. So Sanam directs a diverse portfolio of research and policy initiatives addressing key issues such as Gulf Arab security and economic transitions, Iran's regional ambitions, very relevant to our today's discussions, governance and political reform, women's empowerment, and the intersection of climate and socioeconomic challenges. In addition to her policy work, Sanam holds the James Anderson Professional Lectureship in Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and in Bologna, Italy, where she has taught Middle East politics since 2008. There is many more, but I guess we will also get to that during our discussion. Hello, Sanam, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Ksenia. It's lovely to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And just a small disclosure, I'm an associate at the Chatham House, so this is just to put on the table. But no special discounts will be made. There will be tough questions and important and very genuine discussion. So, Sanam, you're following Middle East for quite some time, and you're researching it deeply, and you're traveling around the region. Once upon a while, when I was a student of the Middle East, I studied about, the time of the Arab Rebellion and the independence of Arab countries and Six-Day War. And it seemed to me, everything important already happened. Like this turbulence and all of that, that's already in the past. But then the 2022 came. And I guess things happen. Did you ever think that we will be currently in 2026 with war raging between Iran and, Israel and the United States, where also many other fronts, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, seems to be open as well. So this is kind of the first question. And the complementary question is, where do you think we will be in 10 years from now? Will we be better off?
Definitely, you're not making it easy for me. You're starting with a really hard question. And I think you're right. I also grew up studying the Middle East and thought the region has lived and experienced so many tumultuous events and wars and experienced also so many powerful, influential, and not always positive leaders. Yes, I'd hope that history was behind the region. But I think that for over 2 decades now, the region has been in a really monumental transition that has ebbed and flowed, whether it's the U.S. invasion of Iraq, whether it's the Arab uprisings and the consequences that regional states are still living with, or, another, I think, really huge inflection point was October 7th, or 10/7, as Israelis call it, that tragedy and the war in Gaza, which as that was unfolding, it became clear to me, but I think to many analysts and researchers, that the regional landscape was undergoing a profound shift. Israel was looking to address its security concerns. After October 7th, Israel was very clear in that it wasn't facing a single-fronted war, but a 7-fronted war. And it became clear to me that the dynamics in the region had shifted profoundly. To answer your question, I'm not surprised by the direct conflict between Israel and Iran that we have seen mounting and building really since 2024. But what I am surprised about is that there have been real clear miscalculations and misreadings of the Islamic Republic. I've always been very impressed that Israeli intelligence has understood the dynamics in Iran really well. I've experienced that in my conversations in Israel, but I'm really just astounded how this past war from February 28th was really executed with faulty analysis. And so, if I want to think about the future, I'm not particularly optimistic. I don't think I can project out 10 years, but I do think that it will be very hard to unravel the fault line that is really sedimenting between Israel and Iran. It's been building for, over 2 decades. And now I think we're going to be, in a more serious period of competition and containment between the two countries that will have profound consequences for both countries, their people, and their neighbors.
Well, let's talk about these miscalculations, shall we? Because in your recent piece, you argued that it was actually Iran's cultivation of the excess of resistance that brought it exactly to the war that it tried to avoid so hard. So let's start maybe with Iran, and then we'll go to every other member of this quagmire, Israel and the United States.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it is important to take a historical view of how we got here. And in doing that, one has to also consider the worldview and ideology of Iran's leaders that are not monolithic, that are very heterogeneous. But, what drove the revolution to succeed was a desire for independence, was a desire for non-interference by outside powers in Iranian affairs, and a very sort of profound hostility to the West and the United States itself. And by virtue of that, Israel was sort of drawn in, lumped as a proxy of the West, if you will. A colonial enterprise is how it is seen by the revolutionary leadership in Iran. And out of the revolution, there was a desire for Iran to have an independent foreign policy, but a foreign policy that would protect Iran from attack, from invasion. And that, of course, grew out of the experience of the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 years, where almost all the countries of the region supported Iraq in its effort at seizing Iranian territory. And from there, the concept of forward defense developed, where Iran would try to push its perceived threats as far away from its borders. And that is how slowly Iran began to cultivate ties with groups that existed already in and across Arab countries. Hezbollah was nurtured and supported. Obviously, Iran from there went on to build ties with other indigenous groups, be it Palestinian movements in Gaza and in the West Bank, eventually also taking advantage of instability and weak governance in Yemen with the Houthis, but also in Iraq after the U.S. invasion through the support of the Hashd-e-Shaabi as well. Iran's only sort of state ally was the Assad regime. And, effectively, Iran created a sort of web of influence to push back against its threats and to project power close to and around Israel. And of course, over time, I think it was inevitable that Israel would move beyond trying to degrade the capabilities of these threats on its borders and try to really weaken, if not destroy, these threats. I think, though, what has been a bit of an awakening across the region is because these groups are indigenous, though, and not Iranian, and because there is a sort of local support to some degree within these societies for these groups. The military process of weakening these groups alone isn't really adequate to solve Israel's security dilemma. And the same can then be applied on a bigger perspective and a bigger scale with regards to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Well, there is this always a looming question mark of whether, it's possible to defeat these groups militarily or otherwise in states that can be regarded as failed states. Lebanon definitely one, Yemen is one. So in this, sense, when nobody provides security, nobody provides services and so on. So these groups that are supported by Iran come in. And maybe they do a lousy job, but they do something. And that's why, when nobody else is active in this sphere, then it's inevitable that these groups will reappear again, even if they were crushed at some point.
Absolutely. Iran has definitely developed an opportunistic model where, based on the weak governance structures in many of these countries, it has exploited the needs and perhaps the ambitions of some of these groups to develop ties that are oftentimes misinterpreted as religious. They're actually much more ideological. They're, ambitious local groups that are looking to assert power, and they share a common worldview of resistance. And who or what are they trying to resist? In general, they see the Western or U.S. Arc of influence in the Middle East as profoundly negative. And that is the commonality among the so-called axis of resistance. It's not a sectarian umbrella organization. In fact, focusing on the sectarian linkages misses the power of resistance as a narrative on its own.
Yeah, well, the dominating narrative in Israel is that Iran was working for years to create this kind of circle of fire. At some point, when the inevitable war would occur, then they were to activate all of this or some of these groups in order to enhance their position and perhaps secure their survival. Well, it seems that this thesis it did not live up to the promise because when Iran was attacked, Hezbollah intervened, but its capabilities were limited, and the Houthis stayed away, and so did the Iraqis. So it didn't really help Tehran in this calculation.
Well, yes and no. I think it's important to see the axis of resistance for what it is, what it's worth, and what it has done for Tehran. And perhaps this might push back against a sort of conventional narrative, because as I understand it, this is how Tehran sees it. This was never going to be a transnational army of defense for Iran. These are groups in countries that have their own interests. This is why, of course, Hezbollah never, even though it is the most ideologically aligned with Tehran, and Hassan Nasrallah had the closest ties with the Iranian leadership relative to the other groups. They never exported or imported the Velayat Faqih, the Islamic governance model of Iran, because the groups had to consider the local dynamics in these countries. And actually, what Iran was trying to do was, of course, have this projection of Iranian power that would provide a buffer against, Israeli strikes. But also, as part of this support process, what Iran helped these groups do is over time become political actors in all of these countries. And that's why the military strategy of degrading the axis of resistance on its own is always going to fail, because Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas aren't just militias now. They're also political entities in these countries and political forces in these countries. So effectively, Iran, that has seen itself always strategically lonely and isolated in the Middle East, found a way of alliances a little too strong, but created partners for itself that it could work with, rely on, sometimes asked to do things. But why the arrangement was relatively viable for Iran was it wasn't very costly for Iran in terms of resource, but secondly, Iran always allowed these groups much more agency. There wasn't a command and control structure. There was much more of a give and take in these relationships that I think is important to understand. So, bearing that worldview in mind, I think it's also important to see the operational success or weaknesses of the axis of resistance that is not static. It is constantly adapting. After the death of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, the axis of resistance went through a phase of adaptation, if you will. Qasem Soleimani had real strong command and control over the axis. He had personal relationships. He was effectively, as he is known, the shadow commander of these groups. But without him in place, Iran had to find a different management strategy of the axis, and Iran was paying the price already by 2020 for supporting the axis. So it took a bit more of a decentralized model, and tried to force the axis groups to cooperate. And that's sort of part of their strategy that came into place, perhaps leading up to 10/7, for example. And Iran also tried to force Hezbollah to moderate these groups a bit more. And perhaps Hezbollah was a bit more of a natural manager of the axis of resistance compared to Iran, which was sort of culturally a bit dissimilar. There were language barriers, different sort of challenges, if you will. And from Iran's thinking, actually, we still don't have full access to documents or evidence as to, who did what and how everything was organized. But Iran still sees the axis of resistance as having helped Iran because while the axis was operational or militarily intact, it did prevent Iran from becoming in the direct line of Israel's fire. It's only after the axis was incrementally targeted by Israel that Iran became vulnerable. So that is something to understand because at the end of all of this, Iran still thinks the axis is useful. But
So they bought time. They bought time.
yes. And then secondly, what's important to understand is that Iran sees the axis of resistance as much more resilient. And no, they didn't come in and develop this collective fighting force to protect Iran, but they each played a little part, particularly in this 38-day war where Hezbollah came in, even if it didn't make sense for Hezbollah to come in. The Hashid came in, even though they've been targeted for the first time since 10/7. The Houthis came in, even though they didn't really do anything, but they reminded everyone that they were there and they were the last line in Tehran's playbook that could have been activated if the war escalated. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind. It's not so black and white. There's a lot of gray in the interpretation.
Well,
Sorry
as
for the
usual.
long answer.
Yeah. So the demand of mainly Israel, because the US is not actually including this demand right now into its list for Iran to let go of the proxies and stop supporting it, not something that can happen realistically.
Definitely not. Really, because, well, first of all, as you said, President Trump does not have that as his number one issue. That is a regional demand of Iran, not just an Israeli demand. But second of all, I think a discussion on regional issues is urgent and necessary, but it would require a bit more honesty in terms of Iran's deterrence and defense capabilities. Iran isn't going to actively dismantle what limited defense capabilities it has, and it's relied on asymmetrical defense now for a number of decades. But secondly, if we're going to play this game of talking about Iran's proxies, Iran being Iran is going to want everybody else to talk about their proxies. And Iran is not the only country in the region that supports proxy groups. Israel does it, the Emiratis do it, many other countries, Turkey and Saudi have done it. So if Iran is expected to lay its cards on the table, it is certainly going to expect everyone else to also make commitments on sovereignty, non-interference, and the like. And I think that would be an important conversation to have, but it would have to be across the region, not just an Iran-only conversation.
Absolutely. Continuing with this theme of miscalculations, and you just now mentioned the asymmetrical war that Iran still wages actually against some of their countries. I personally remember threats that were being hurled, by Iranians at their Arab neighbors for many years. And one of them was, I think, just recently, 2022, 23, when they said, well, we know where your glass towers are, so, be careful with that. Why were some elements in US surprised? Why they could but surprised that Iran actually lived up to this promise, and maybe it was expected that they would do it, in some shallow way, not really targeting the important infrastructure in the way they did. But were you surprised, by these attacks of the Emiratis, Saudis, and basically everybody else in the region?
That is the real question and the real tragedy and gravity of this war, if you ask me. There is absolutely no doubt, I think, in anyone's mind that this would have played out this way, anyone who works on these regions and issues as an analyst. And there was no doubt that the Strait of Hormuz would come into play. We've all gamed out such an outcome in the multiple war games that we've all participated in. And I think that there are a few reasons for these miscalculations. First of all, there is in the U.S. Under the second Trump administration, I think that there has been a hollowing out of the U.S. Bureaucracy, where there has been a long history and track record of excellent expertise that understands Iran, but perhaps these individuals were not consulted in the way that they should have been. The interagency process didn't come together in sort of marshaling and preparing for this war.
I also hear from friends in DC who are working in think tanks that they do not meet officials anymore. Nobody's interested in the research that they are doing for years, and they could have certainly some kind of recommendations in this regard.
This is a very insular administration. I'm going to DC, and it's like the hunt for Red October. You're trying to figure out who you can talk to that has influence in the system. And, it is hard for me, and it's hard for my colleagues in DC as well. I can imagine. But there is a wealth of expertise on Iran. So none of this should have been a surprise there. And the US intelligence agencies, I think, have also done a fantastic job in actually reading Iran correctly. But again, I think that the seven men that come together to sort of drive decision making in the Oval Office, perhaps are skeptical of intelligence and don't trust these processes because they have a different worldview. And of course, some of the reporting that is open source now has made it clear that this was presented by Prime Minister Netanyahu in a PowerPoint presentation as an easy win, that Iran, after the back and forth strikes of 2024, the 12-day war, and then the protests of January 2026 was weakened. And so this would be an opportunistic time for Israel and the United States to accomplish, I'm not sure what yet, or still, but to try and dismantle, degrade, and even destroy the Islamic Republic. This is where we are. The president got into it.
That's fascinating. The words easy win and Iran, they just don't work together in no circumstances. There could be no circumstances, I'm sure, that will allow for this, words to come together and make some kind of sense.
Absolutely. I think this is political malpractice. Because these were all known knowns. These were not unknown knowns or unknown unknowns. Again, there is like a whole community of Iranian analysts out there that have been working on Iran for decades that have been producing, I think, pretty decent scholarship, even at different ideological prisms, that are of the view that the system is much more institutionalized, it's not personalized, it's much more bureaucratized. And it feels like the analyst community that aren't activists, but just sort of reporting what they see based on evidence, facts on the ground, etc., has just been sort of pushed aside. And the activist community that has tried to lobby for, ideals rather than reality won out here.
Wow. Going back to the Arab states, it seems to me that, there is massive reevaluation right now of the existing alliances and the actually worldview, because the states depended for years, for at least like 30 years since the war in the Gulf, when the Americans created this massive alliance to liberate Kuwait, and so on. So they hosted bases and they thought that they would be protected by the Americans. It seems to me that there are not much choices out there. It's not that you can just, reach some other superpowers and ask them for protection right now. But what is actually going on? Because we see a big difference between the UAE's position and Saudi, that is more reaching out regionally to Pakistan, Egypt, and certainly Turkey than before, and seems to look for its way for some kind of a different regional architecture for security.
Yeah, I think there are going to be short, medium, and long-term consequences to this war. I hope it's not just because I'm so steeped in it that I'm thinking this way, but I really think this is sort of one of these inflection points in the region. The region has a number of fault lines. I think that's important to understand. There's the Israeli-Iran fault line. There's a Turkey-Israel fault line. There are intra-Gulf fault lines that are important to understand. And now, of course, is sort of reactivation of an Iran Gulf fault line, if you will. And I think these fault lines, really drive competition and different visions of what the regional order should be. Ultimately, my view is that there needs to be something inclusive rather than exclusive. But if you look at the Gulf states, certainly prior to this war, going back to 2025, actually, when Qatar was hit after the 12-day war and then again by Israel on September 8th, that sort of was the two sort of awakening moments that highlighted the risks of the American security umbrella, or where people began to discuss how these were red lines that had been crossed. I don't think anyone was imagining that we would be where we are today, but there have been frustrations percolating across the Gulf for over a decade now with regards to the United States, going back to the Obama administration, thinking about the Iran nuclear agreement, where Gulf concerns were left out, thinking about the attacks on the Aramco facilities by the Iranians in 2019. So there have been a lot of these frustrations, and the Gulf states collectively and individually have been looking to stabilize their relationship with Washington so that it just becomes reliable regardless of the domestic politics in the U.S. And the outcome has been a variety of different tactics to stabilize the relationship. The reality for the UAE is that, they went into the Abraham Accords. They thought this was also an opportunity to stabilize the relationship with Washington. But Saudi and a number of other states have taken a different approach. They thought gradual normalization and integration with Iran and Israel would be the best pathway ahead. But here, of course, Gaza and Israel's strategy on Palestine, or lack thereof, was a big obstacle that would impact Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, this war will obstruct further normalization between other Gulf states and Iran. And so I think the region doesn't have alternatives to the United States in the short or medium term. But I think over the medium to long term, we will see much more diversification of security relationships across the Middle East and globally as the Gulf tries to develop more strategic autonomy and tries to have a diversified portfolio of economic, security, and political ties in order to insulate itself from the geopolitical shifts at the top and from all of these competing fault lines in the Middle East.
Well, the Saudi, Pakistani, Egyptian, and Turkish axis lines, it's really hard to say what it is right now still. And there also you have some simmering tensions, that they were perhaps, laid for a side, for this time. But it seems like a very interesting development because Pakistan is extremely close with China, for example. It's also close with the US. But in general, it seems that this inner Middle Eastern alliances, they also will play out in this big game between the big powers.
Yes, I agree with that, but I wouldn't call them alliances because I don't think we're at the alliance point.
Tactical alliances.
Yeah, I do note that Israel yesterday or last week referred to the UAE as an ally. And I think that there's some analysis that is trying to put these four countries into a block against the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, for example. And I don't think that that's quite right. I think that there are areas of collaboration and partnership that are, perhaps coalitions of the willing or opportunities where there is a sort of meeting of the minds and an understanding that in the disorder of this Trump period, it makes sense to have mini-lateral groupings, if you will. But I don't think that there's zero sum. I think that there will be cross-pollination, if you will. And at Chatham House, we call this, or in my program at Chatham House, we call this multi-alignment, where there is no, sort of black or white days of the Cold War. And you can partner with Turkey on, let's say, the Iran project. But if Turkey, for example, pursues a different calculation in Syria, you would maybe, contest that. So multi-alignment makes regional politics and the regional order much more complicated. And it also makes conflict management and political settlements much harder to see through.
Well, this is really enlightening, because again, you see the kind of regional perspectives that are reflected in the Emirati newspapers, in Israeli newspapers, in Saudi. And apropos Saudis, there was this fascinating piece by Prince Turki Al Faisal, who I think that, it seems to me that it might be coming as an answer to all of these theories that have been floated that, Saudi Arabia actually wanted Trump to go all the way. And they were secretly saying one thing and, publicly another thing that also, by the way, could always be true. But nevertheless, he was very, very blunt to say, well, it's Israel and the United States. They were trying to basically play us out against Iran to imply always that Saudi Arabia is joining. It's almost joining, it's like 5 minutes and it will join the war. And it's not in our interest. So I wanted to ask you, like a deeper question, perhaps. So Saudi Arabia did try to accommodate Iran, to contain it in the most gentle way, I think. Yes, so it didn't play off its guards completely, but still, there was trade, there was diplomacy, and so on. So there was some regional dynamics. And the Emiratis, of course, they, promoted extensive trade with Iran that is so close to, can you really, and this is also, perhaps relevant to Israel and Hamas approach, Israel-Hamas before the 10/7 attacks. Can you really accommodate the rogue actors, may it be Hamas, may it be Hezbollah, may it be Iran? Can you really try to, through, this realistic approach, well, let's do trade, let's do some humanitarian work, let's, stop fighting and focus on, the civilian stuff and so on. When that eventually, this organization, so state, they have something else in mind, so, and they will not let go of the military confrontation at some point.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, first of all, Prince Turki's piece was very interesting, and I think Saudi Arabia has been trying to increase its communications to make clear what the position of the government has been. I was really struck through the war how much misinformation and disinformation.
This is the real war. This is a real war.
This was the real war. And, it's worthwhile just, making it clear to your listeners that no country in the Middle East, including Israel, including Iran, all of the Gulf states, no one was allowing access to what was really happening on the ground, truly showing the damage. And every day I was asked by journalists ad nauseum if Saudi Arabia supported the war, if the Emiratis were involved in lobbying, if they were going to join the war. I mean, it was fascinating, and every day answering the same questions over and over again. But it's good that we have the clear position right now, and I think it speaks to the challenges that Saudi Arabia is facing going forward. Because yes, it did try this diplomatic outreach to Iran, as did the UAE. I think, though, we have to see all of this as very much the evolution of these relationships. First of all, it's worthwhile noting that the Saudi Arabia and Iran still have maintained their diplomatic ties. The ambassador sits in Riyadh, and that's quite striking, despite the attacks. That both countries have tried to maintain the diplomatic bridge that exists between them. And I think for the kingdom, that's because they're worried about the day after. They're worried about how this war ends. I think they're very worried about the long-term commitment of the United States to the region. And President Trump is an unpredictable president who, a few weeks ago at a Saudi-funded event in Miami at FII, basically said the Saudis should kiss my bleep. And I think these are alarming comments for the kingdom that have, the relationships with the US have been sort of up and down, but generally pretty consistent. And there's been a lot of bilateral investment. So
especially now, before the war.
Especially now, they invested in President Trump. They welcomed him to Riyadh. They believed he wasn't going to be a regime changer. And here they're in the midst of this tumult and instability. They want to have what Israel has, the real special relationship, but they recognize that, perhaps that's never going to happen for them. So I think that they're keeping the door open to Tehran, not because they will forget or overlook this war, but they recognize, I think quite clearly, and people will say this was not Iran's war. This was the US and Israel's war. And, nobody considered how Iran was going to react, or the vulnerabilities of the Gulf states, or the geography of the Gulf states. And, that is something that is, quietly discussed across the Gulf right now, that, nobody considered their assets, their infrastructure, and only belatedly, was there this effort to marshal support and protect the Gulf states. And from Iran's perspective, they really gambled and threw away, I think, a huge amount of progress they made in rehabilitating and normalizing ties with the Gulf. But it speaks, and this is no justification by any means of the Iranian attacks across the GCC, but it speaks to the existential nature of this war for Iran and the fact that they pursued this horizontal attritional strategy in order to quickly spread the cost because they were the weaker, military power in this war. And to a certain degree, it proved to be effective for Iran because very quickly, the costs have been borne not just by the Islamic Republic or Iranians, but by a lot of people, including across the Gulf and for many of us, in other countries around the world.
I will not ask you when this war will end. It's not fair. But I can ask you, how can it end? What the conditions that needs to be created for this war to be over?
Well, let me just say this. I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to get a clean ending. I would like us to get a clean ending, but unfortunately, there remains, I think, a misunderstanding of the Islamic Republic in Washington. These are people in power that are protecting the regime, but protecting their future in this regime. And the fact that they survived this war has, emboldened them in a way that I don't think is really appreciated in capitals, be it Jerusalem or Washington, D.C. And they have a different sort of time and mindset. They feel that they've also created a stronger support inside the country. They've made it clear to the Iranian people that they're not going anywhere. So in a way, they've, bought themselves a bit of time, even though the economic consequences of this war are serious for Iran. Also, I would just say this is not a group of people that makes their decisions based on GDP or inflation or unemployment. Had they done so, they would have been in a different sort of decision-making calculus decades ago. So I think appreciating what we have at the end of the military conflict for now is important to understand. And then I think the only way out of this conflict is through a structured negotiation that pressures and incentivizes Iran, but also Washington, in order to make concessions. This is not a group of people in Tehran today that are going to submit to President Trump's demands. This isn't Venezuela. They are, as I've said, have a different motivation. And so I think it's about creating a sequenced, reliable, verifiable deal that will be accepted by everybody. Because why Iran has pursued this strategy is to make sure there isn't going to be another one. No more mowing of the lawn, no more 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whenever, somebody finds some new satellite information. So I think that's what we need. I'm not terribly confident we're going to get there because of President Trump, because of the worldview, perhaps in Israel, perhaps also because of this multi-aligned world that can't really deliver political settlements. And so we will probably be back here.
Well, basically we are stuck. Sanam, the last question for you, although I have many, many more to ask you, but our time is running out. The war between Iran, Israel, and the US has drawn attention away from Gaza, West Bank, and the Palestinian issue. How has the conflict impacted the prospects for any kind of possibility for peacemaking? And what role, if any, do you see for the Arab states? In reviving this process? We know that the Europeans just now introduced sanctions against violent settlers, a little bit too little too late, but still, nevertheless, it's important development. But otherwise, you see that that this issue is just not in the center of attention anymore.
Yeah, I think this is the real travesty of this war, but it really shows us that right now there is no bandwidth or capability for countries, be it in Europe, the United States, or even in the Middle East, to be able to do too many things at the same time. And so this war has allowed for no attention, no, pressure to be put on the dynamics in Gaza, as I understand it. NCAG hasn't even gone into Gaza. There continues to be settlement expansion in the West Bank. In tandem, of course, nobody probably even paid attention that there were sort of municipal elections in in Palestine. So this is really problematic. We should be able to walk and chew gum simultaneously. The security and stability, I would argue, of Israel, but the whole Middle East is highly dependent on thinking of new creative ways to get to a political settlement. And here I think the onus is also on Arab states that have been a little too cautious in elevating their concerns about what's happening on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank. And condemning through statements alone isn't going to, help the Palestinians or keep the prospect of Palestinian state alive. There needs to be forward-leaning, forward-looking pressure, and again, a coalition of the willing on this project. Otherwise, it will fall to the wayside.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sanam, for joining us today and for sharing your invaluable insights into this complex strategic regional shifts. It has been a truly illuminating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to talk to you.
You've been listening to ROPESCAST, the independent voice of the Middle East. To learn more about our ROPES work, to support our mission of building regional integration, or to listen to more episodes of the ROPESCAST, please visit our website at ropes.org. You can also follow us on social media to stay updated on our latest initiatives and solidarity visits across the region. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to having you with us for our next episode. Shalom and salam.